Welcome back to the Decoy Shed. Today, the Decoy Shed crew is on the road in Edgerton, Wisconsin. This is our first decoy show of the year. Let's go in and see what treasures we can find. Hi folks, we're here today with Tom Armbrust and Marty Sands, and we're going to talk about big bore shotguns. Okay, so what do we have here?
This is a Army and Navy single shot 4-gauge. And this was actually a nitro gun, so it was actually designed for modern smokeless powder. But most of these guns, most of the frames, besides the greeners, if they have the big Jones underlever, which is opens like that, there's no springs, it's just one mechanical screw lever, and it's one of the most simplest lock designs. Those are mostly probably built by Bland or a few others. So they would actually make the frame and then send it out to Holland and whoever else, and they would finish the gun by putting stocks and barrels and do all the action work. But this gun weighs about 16.5 pounds, and it still is between your hands, and it handles very well. I mean, it goes up actually pretty smooth. And it was designed, all of these guns were designed for long-range pass shooting. They were not designed for, blasting 50 ducks on the water at once. It was single birds at high altitudes. Basically, in England, especially in England, the ducks and geese would be on the ocean, and they'd come in the morning to the fields, and so the only place that the average person could hunt was called the foreshore, which was from the water line out to where the water receded. And everyone else owned all the land. That was all with the driven birds. That was big money. And all the other people, the duck hunters, were the average people. And so all they had to do, or the only thing they could do, is to do pass shooting. That's all they had. So they had super tight chokes, big charge shots, and they were, shooting at long ranges, 100 yards or 120 yards is what they were shooting at.
Wow. And overall length, how long is that gun?
Barrel length is 42. Yeah, this barrel length is actually a little shorter than a lot of them because it's a smokeless gun. It's 42. Sometimes you'll see them 36 to 38. But a lot of the 4 gauges, like the other one we have over there, has a 48-inch black powder barrel on it.
For the same purpose.
The same purpose.
Long range. Long range.
Long range, basically like this. And when you get straight up and down is the closest, and you swing through them and drop the bird every time.
And this breech design, very strong, right?
Yes. This Jones actually lost his patent. He forgot to pay his patent tax, and after 3 years, he lost his patent. They said it was the most used English gun patent for about 30 years, and he didn't get any royalties off it whatsoever because he forgot to pay his taxes on his patent. And it was probably another reason why they used it so much too.
Now these are pretty special guns. I mean, not the average person didn't go out and purchase a gun like this to use, right?
Not unless he was fairly wealthy, I would think.
All right. So tell me, these guns obviously have a history of their own. So share with us some of the history of these firearms that you have.
Well, this particular gun, I bought it the year I was married because my wife was kind of going to be crazy. I paid $2,750 for it in 1976. There was an outfit called the Trading Post in, I think, Dallas, Texas, and the guy's name was Billy Hodge, the owner. He had brought in 2 English apprentices that are now big English gun makers in this country for restoration. And I can't remember their names, but they both advertise regularly in periodicals. And when I got the gun, the first thing I looked at after I told him I wanted it, because it was in great shape, I noticed it said Chicago Expo 1893 on the barrel flaps when I took it apart, and I really didn't know what that meant. So I called him back, and he goes, he said Greener was a blowhard. That was on all their guns. So I went to gun shows quite frequently then, too. And maybe a year or two later, I found this softcover pamphlet. It showed all the guns by serial numbers and descriptions that were showed in the Chicago World's Fair for 1893 by Greener. Serial number 34750 was in there. A complete description of the gun, which this was in there. So then when I got to know Marty good, he's great at emailing, and we personally know Greener. He's what, 5th generation?
5th generation grandson of the owners.
So he would email him, and he gave me a whole working letter on this gun, the men that worked on it, the time involved, and the cost. So it's all documented. And it took a year to make within a few weeks, and I don't think it was terribly expensive. It was a 35 guinea gun, which is, roughly 35 English pounds. I would imagine The pound at the World's Fair time was probably maybe $5. But again, you could have bought a brand new Model 97 pump for $12.50.
Right.
So this was a much more expensive gun. But it's not highly ornate. You can see it's very plainly finished. I don't think there's any engraving on it at all, just the name. Beautiful Damascus barrels, but they probably were showing that for waterfowling with the salt water,
right,
they didn't need a highly elaborate gun.
Right.
But it's very unusual. I mean, it was one of one. They had one 4-gauge elephant rifle, and then this for a big.
Now I see you have a very fine example of a greener in this case, and there's a special story about that gun too, right?
Yes, there is.
Tell us about that.
This gun I found in Cabela's in Minnesota probably 8-9 years ago, and it was like pulling teeth, but I got a little bit of the story. An airlines pilot had brought it back from Japan from a family in the 50s, the gun, and he just threw it in the cockpit and flew home, because I guess then we didn't have all those rules and regulations. And he'd had it for many years at his home, and then I guess he decided he wanted to sell it, so it was brought to Cabela's. So Marty saw the ad either online or someplace, and he called me, so I went up there and looked at it. And I was really amazed, because I think they were asking like $10,000 or $11,000 for it, which I knew was a very fair price. So I traded in a number of my own smaller gauge guns for it, and so I asked them if they knew the history about it, and they said, well, this airlines pilot, I will ask him if he can have his phone number and we can talk to him. He'd been retired for quite a long time. I think he flew for American. And anyway, he did. I think he said he brought the gun home in '59. And he told me what he paid for it. I'm thinking it was like $500 in American. And a Japanese family had it, and their grandfather was some representative.
I think it was like some ambassador
of some sort to England. Well, he was presented with the gun by his shooting friends. Well, Japanese are not very big people, so the gun was humongous for him, so he actually had a 12-gauge barrel set made that fits on the gun, so that way at least he can handle it. And surprisingly, with the 12-gauge extra barrel set, it handles pretty decently. But even so, I'm sure it was a struggle for him, but he probably didn't want to, if his friends put that much money into a gift, he wanted to show him that he could at least use it. So that was kind of unique, too.
Terrific.
And you would ask about the tools.
Yes.
Our good friend John Miller in British Columbia, these are not original tools like I showed you, because he puts a stamp on the bottom, the British, where he puts the Canadian Oakley file with his initials, because if these were original, like this oil bottle, it'd probably go for $500 to $1,000 just the bottle if it's legit, so that's why he does that. But they are
his tools use real ebony wood, and he's actually he worked in gold mines up in Alaska, and he learned how to do all that by looking at it. He doesn't use blueprints. He does it all out of his mind. So if he builds something for you, you have to send it back to him, because he doesn't have a copy of what he built. But his tools are probably better than almost any English tools you've ever seen, the originals. Like I said, he worked in the gold mines and had to build everything from scratch. If something broke, they couldn't ship it in. They had to build it there. He had to harden it, make it, and everything else. So his tools are, people all over the country have him build all these tools for him because of the quality of them.
So you guys have been telling me that these guns are really easy to handle, the balance right between your hands. So give me an example. Can you have something that will demonstrate?
Well, this gun, first of all, was actually a factory hooks, and we got that from Graham Greener. It was a letter, and it was an argument between I think the production manager in the shop and Edwin Greener at the time. And what happened is there was two guns very similar, a 10 gauge and a 12 gauge, that were being built. It'd take about a year. The machinist in the shop thought that this was going to be the 8 gauge. They bored it to an 8, but this was supposed to be the 10 gauge customer's gun. So then it became the extremely light 8 gauge. It's only about 10.5 pounds, which is where most 10 gauges should be. And it only has 32-inch barrels. So this thing is very, very live feeling, like a live bird gun, we would say. So we, at his trap club, they have an annual picnic and summer picnic, and we brought a bunch of loaded, just trap load shells, pretty light. I think they were 1 3/8 or 1.5 ounces of shot. And there was about 29 kids and maybe a few adults that shot it. and we put them at the 27-yard line at the trap, and they only got one shell each, and kept handing the gun back, and every single person from the 27-yard line destroyed the target out.
And this would have been the first time they ever handled the gun.
Ever handled the gun.
Or maybe first time a lot of them ever shot even side by side.
Side by side, or a big double. But the interesting thing, like I said, is they end up in the factory. They had to make an executive decision that this gun had a cheaper frame. Internals were cheap. But this was supposed to be the 8 gauge with the really fancy stuff. So they had to swap it and basically put all the fancy engraving on a cheap frame, and the customer probably would never know, because they had to make a 10 gauge, and the guy wanted a heavy 10 gauge, and the other guy wanted a light 8, and so they both actually ended up getting each other's guns without knowing it.
Wow, that's great. Now, Tom, you were telling me that this is actually your duck gun. Is that right? Tell us about this one.
Yeah, Marty and I and 2 other fellas, we lease a little spot just below Lake Geneva, and I got to use this gun quite a bit this year up there. I only shot 2 mallets with it, but I harvested a half a dozen nice geese. And Marty years ago was lucky enough to find a bunch of tungsten matrix factory loads, and we got them very reasonable. So every once in a while, amputate a few of the shot charges, and I loaded in this with about 1.5 ounces, and it's very effective. This is a short 10. It's a 2 7/8 chamber. It's not the long Magnum, the 3.5 inch like nowadays, but it's very effective. It's got tight chokes. It'll be mostly pass shoot, and it's very effective out in this 50 to 60 yard range if you do your part. So it's a nice little gun. I just love the greeners. It fits me very nice. It's got modern dimensions. The stock was raised with hot oil and heat a few years ago. They brought it up about 3/4 inch in the back, so it fits very well. It's a nice thin comb, so for a lefty, I'm not looking down the right side of the rib.
Right.
So it works very well.
So.
And the side safety, remember we had mentioned that, so if anybody ever sees a side safety, if it's not a German gun, it's usually a greener, because the Germans
copied the greener design.
Oh, is that right? Fascinating. So if the viewers wanted to find out more about these large bore guns, where would you suggest that they look? Are there resources out there?
Well, they could. I've got a company called Ballistic Research. I do testing for pressure and velocity. We'll build cartridges, we'll design loads to your gun, whatever, so they could get a hold of it.
Any gauge,
any
410
gauge.
to 4 gauge.
But the fun part's working with the big guns. For us, I work with regular stuff too.
Some of the articles, most of the stuff we get is research was, a lot of articles done back in the 20s and 30s when they were switching over to the 10 gauge Magnum, and there has been a lot of articles all through the 60s on a lot of these type of guns. But there's not a lot of information out there, and that's why we come to the shows. We buy tables and display them, not for selling. We actually display them because we want to inform people what these things were actually. They're not a gun that's going to knock you on the ground. They weren't used for market hunting and shooting 50 birds at once. They were used for long-range pass shooting, and most of the time by probably very prominent people that had enough money to go out and buy these at that time.
So if someone were to run across one of these in another Cabela's or another gun shop somewhere, and they're looking at it, what would be your suggestion or advice as to how do they know the gun's in good condition? Should they take it to a gunsmith and have them take a look at it, make sure that it's operating correctly and safely? So what would be your advice on something like that?
Definitely, but there's more than a few gunsmiths that don't know enough about these guns either. For one, you have to have the right tools and gauges. So a lot of them, we've made chamber length gauges, on the right taper. Then you can check the chamber length, and if it's a Damascus gun, you got to make sure that it's not terribly pitted. And one thing nice about the heavy big bore guns, they have a lot of wall thickness, meaning the breeches are very massive, so you can do some honing safely. Now, if you've got a game gun that weighs 6.5 pounds, it'll be much thinner in the wall.
Paper thin, and
so you have to be very careful. Right. But yeah, a number of these guns I've honed as much as 5,000s out of them, and they look like brand new. And again, many people go, oh my gosh, they're Damascus, you'll blow yourself up. That's not true. When I was in England in 2000, then again in 2002 in Scotland, most of the men I hunted with were all shooting vintage Damascus doubles with modern ammunition. not steel, but modern ammunition.
Right.
And they were all re-nitro proof
By
in
the
the proof house.
by
And
the
they said
proof
it's
houses.
almost unheard of that a good Damascus gun ever fails proof at a reproof. So they said a lot of that was just the stuff that wasn't good to begin with if it didn't.
There's a lot of cheap, especially in the American market, the Belgian market, a lot of the Damascus got a bad name because of the very cheap thirds and seconds and thirds barrels. The English used the first quality barrel. Everything else got sold to the United States and to Belgium. So a lot of that stuff that was put in the really cheap guns, and there's a lot of the guns that probably should never be shot with almost any loads, just because of the quality of the metal and the condition of it after work hardening and all that stuff. What happens to metal over 100 years of use?
So if viewers wanted to get more information, they can just contact you guys.
So either one of us contact us, and we can help them out with loads and data, information, all those things.
Great. Thanks, guys.
You're very welcome.
you.